Hello everyone. Tonight, I'll be narrating 3 new creepy stories that I found off of the Let's Not Meet subreddit. So sit back and relax, because tonight, we'll be diving headfirst into their experiences.
These other stories.
When I was 20 years old, so 6 years ago, I worked as a delivery girl for a pretty popular pizzeria in my area. Initially, I worked the late morning to mid-afternoon shift, but when the guy who delivered for the night shift ended up getting fired due to him losing his license because of a DUI, I was placed on the night shift since my boss hired a family friend who could only work my shift for whatever reason. I really didn't want this shift because you never know if people who order late at night actually want a pizza or if they have other intentions in mind. Unfortunately, my boss isn't the nicest of people and essentially told me if I wasn't willing to work the night shift, I was fired. I wasn't exactly in a position where I could be out of work, albeit temporarily, so I reluctantly worked the shift. The first month of this shift, I went by without any issues, until I had to deliver a pizza to a house that just barely made our delivery radius. I punched it in on my GPS, and the house was located in a pretty suburban part of the city. I arrive and it's about 11 p.m. The block was extremely quiet, decently lit, and mostly littered with modern townhouses, but the house I delivered to was a duplex. I ring the doorbell and wait for about 30 seconds. No answer. I ring it again and wait another 30 seconds. Still no answer. I'm standing there getting pretty nervous that something's about to go down, but thankfully a man opens the door. He looked like he was in his late 40s. He was pretty tall, maybe a little over 6 foot, and he was very skinny. I tell him his pizza is here and he just stands there staring at me. I asked him if he was okay and he responded by saying, "Yeah, I'm fine, sorry. I got off work not too long ago and I'm just zoning out a bit." Fair enough, I suppose. He hands me the money. I hand him the pizza, and as I'm making change he says, "You're really beautiful, you know that?" Not really thinking too much into it, I thanked him for the compliment and gave him his change. I said goodnight and he did too. I walked back to my car and finished my deliveries for the night. A few days later, I get a delivery order to the same place. I head over there around the same time as last time and ring the doorbell. He answers the door very excitedly and says, "Hey, it's you again. How are you?" I told him I was tired and I can't wait to go home, to which he chuckled and said, "I know that feeling pretty well," as he was pulling out his wallet. As he's counting his money, he asked me what my name is. Being kinda tired at this point and not really thinking straight, I stupidly told him my name. As I'm making change, he asked if he could have my number, as he'd love to hang out with someone as gorgeous as I am. I've literally only met this guy like twice to deliver a pizza. I had no idea who this guy was, and I'm positive he barely knew who I was as well. Another thing to mention is I looked way younger than I was at that time. I was told by numerous people that I still looked like I was 15, and I was hoping he thought differently as he wasn't hitting on what he thought was a teenager. I'm just standing there awkwardly for a few seconds before I muster out, "Sorry, I have a boyfriend." He gets upset and says, "Oh, okay, I see." We stand there in silence before I tell him to have a good night and walk back to my car. He says nothing and still stands at the doorway staring at me until he finally went back inside once I started my car. I got a pretty creepy vibe from this guy and even brought it up to my coworkers, and they agreed it was pretty creepy. Except for my boss, who overheard everything and claimed I was making up stories and trying to gain sympathy for having to take the shift. A week later, as I'm working the night shift, we get an order from the same guy again, and this is when it finally hits the fan. I arrive at the house at around 10:30 p.m. and keep in mind that from my perspective on the road, it didn't look like a single light in the house was on. I get out of my car and I walk to the front door with the pizza box in my arms. As I'm approaching the door, it quickly swings open to reveal the man, except this time, he was wearing a suit and I jumped back. He laughs and said, "Sorry if I scared you. I saw you out on the window and I figured if I just opened the door now, so you wouldn't have to ring the bell." I was getting scared because, as I mentioned before, there were no lights on in the house, so he was sitting in the dark this whole time. And if so, why? I nervously laugh and say, "It's okay." He asked me if I liked his suit, which I said yes. He then asked me, "Would you like to go on a date with me tonight?" I once again tell him I have a boyfriend, to which he chuckles, gets close to me and says, "There's no way a girl your age is in a serious relationship. You should really go on a date with me." He grabs the pizza box from me and throws it to the side and grabs me by my arms hard. I'm officially sweating bullets at this point and now trying to cry from the fear that was overwhelming me. I start pleading with him, "Dude, please. I just want to go home. I don't want to go on a date tonight." He just stares at me with the most sinister look I've ever seen on someone's face and says, "I don't care. Get inside now. We're gonna have a good time." He starts trying to pull me to the house, and I'm trying to resist as hard as I can. After a bit of struggling, he lets go of one of my arms and starts grabbing something out of his pocket, which I presumed was a knife. I did something to this day that I'm still thankful worked as he was doing that. I used my free arm to punch him as hard as I could in the stomach. This stuns me for a few seconds, and as he loosened his grip on me, allowed me to break free. I quickly run to my car, and as I get in, he runs at me and tries pulling me out of the car, holding the knife in the other arm and just starts yelling. I grab a half-empty soda bottle I had in the cup holder and throw it, and luckily it hits his head and he lets me go. I slam on the door, and then all of a sudden he jumps right on the hood of my car and starts scratching and banging at my windshield with his knife. I put the car in reverse and quickly back out of the spot and quickly reverse down the road with him desperately trying to hold on. He's banging on my hood screaming, "Stop the car!" I turn onto the next road as swiftly as possible, and luckily, he falls off the hood of my car. I slammed the gas as hard as I could to get away from him as far as I could. In my panicked state, I drove a couple blocks down the street and kept making turn after turn onto other side blocks as I feared I was being followed. Eventually, I reached a red light and I slammed on the brakes and just sat at the intersection frozen from what had just happened. I began crying and violently shaking as I was just sitting there. It dawned on me that I came so close to losing my life, and I couldn't help but feel like I shouldn't have been alive. Once the light turned green, I pulled over to the side and just sat there crying. Eventually, I get the energy to drive back to the pizzeria, and almost immediately after I walk in, my coworker knew something was wrong after seeing me. I practically broke down in front of him, and everyone else came to the front wondering what was going on. I fought my tears and explained everything that just happened. My coworker comforted me, and my boss surprised me and began apologizing profusely for what had happened and for putting me on the night shift. He took me into the office and handed me the phone to call the cops. They arrived at the store, and I gave them my statement, as well as taking pictures of any marks on myself, as well as scratches on my car for the encounter as evidence. My coworker followed behind me as I drove home, and I collapsed on my bed, and strangely enough, I managed to fall asleep. I quit my job the next day, and luckily a friend of mine managed to hook me up with a new job at her clothing store. As far as the psycho goes, 2 days later I received an update from the police. The entire duplex is owned by the guy's brother, who lived on the right side with his wife, and the psycho lived on the left side of the duplex. I learned that he had been in and out of jail constantly at first for robberies and assaults. He had been released from jail about 5 months ago apparently. When they arrived at the house, he was long gone and his family had no idea where he ran off to, but the police insisted they would find him. And indeed they did, albeit not alive. I spent the next 2 months in fear that he would find me and finish what he had in mind, but the police contacted me and updated me on the case. Apparently, he fled to another city nearby and attempted to kidnap a teenager walking alone late at night on the street. Luckily, somebody happened to be looking out the window at the right time, called the cops, and the police caught him by trying to force her into his car. He manages to flee and the police chase after him. He blew a red light near a busy boulevard and a van slammed right into the driver's side of his car. By some sort of miracle, the driver of the van only sustained minor injuries, while the psycho succumbed to his wounds long before the ambulance even arrived. I thank the officers for everything they did and for informing me, so I walked out of the station. I walked down the street and I light up a cigarette as I'm taking in everything that I'd just been told. I don't wish death on people, but after hearing about his death, I felt relieved. I felt relieved that he couldn't hurt anyone anymore. I was relieved that I wouldn't have to ever encounter him again, and that I wouldn't have to go through with charging him and reliving what happened that night. Who knows where I'd be if he managed to pull me into his house. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time when we could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending that we were frontiersmen. We'd build shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a "Stand By Me." This was based on the movie on the same name that just came out. The idea was that we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find cool bridges to fish from and to camp little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we'd likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges no one went to, we fished, we hid from trains. At night, we camped in woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun we did it multiple times. Never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we would see each other occasionally. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We would do stuff with family in the day, and at night, we'd either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are a heck of a mix. Soon, we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night, and walk home. The day came, we started out early morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot where we used to start, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well, we had a map, and so I gave it a screw it, and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started to set in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now, this is what we used to do in the old days too. We'd walk the area around a little bit just to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill and we were actually camping in their yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from up top of the short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be any cleared road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet. No movement could be seen. No lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it and it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of the place, also weathered black. None of the windows had glass, and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews in a built-up section in front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths, no roads. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot that we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up just to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods would elicit. Besides, at this point it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on at early morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks and just talked, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. Do you hear that? What is that? It sounds like people singing. And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree, but it was near pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, "Can you believe this?" The light looked to be a candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the crap out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language, because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something, and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears. Then it stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get the heck out of here," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't really make them out very well, but what we could see was a line of figures walk out the open doorway, all holding hands in single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move toward us and the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our stuff, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill, and they were moving erratically like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town that was about 15 minutes down it, and we walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all just thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices and they sure as hell didn't sound like any kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the most creepiest thing that happened to me out in the woods. So, this happened about 5 years ago while I was 9 months pregnant. I was Christmas shopping at the mall with my then 7 and 15-year-old daughters one Saturday night in a very safe city with very low crime rate. There was an Applebee's connected to the mall, and we ended our shopping pretty late, and the mall stores were starting to close, so I took my kids to the connected Applebee's for a late dinner. We finished up eating at about 10 p.m. to leave out the Applebee's entrance into the practically deserted parking lot with shopping bags in tow. As we got to the car, I was in the middle of maneuvering the shopping bags in my arms to find my keys, when a 50-ish-year-old looking guy starts walking up from somewhere in the parking lot with shaggy gray and white hair and a faded flannel shirt and old jeans. I noticed him briskly approaching when he was about 40 feet away, and he said, "Give me all your money now." My blood ran cold, and I stared at him owlishly and shakingly said, "What?" He then said he was just kidding and came up and stood right next to my daughters, who were standing on the other side of the car, waiting for me to unlock the door to let them in. He then starts making small talk with me and my girls. He's asking things like if they were being good girls for Santa, how old they were, if we got all of our Christmas shopping done, what kind of things did we get, etc. He didn't seem drunk, high, slow, or anything at all. He was very coherent and seemed sound of mind. Mind you, I was a heavily pregnant woman, alone with my 2 daughters in a mostly deserted parking lot at 10 o'clock at night. Was being approached by a stranger who came and stood right next to my kids on the other side of the car, just shooting the breeze, talking to me and my kids with his hands in his pockets and occasionally looking over his shoulder. I didn't want to aggravate him, so I was politely conversing with him and trying to look calm and nonchalant while trying to disguise my frantic hands digging inside of my giant purse for my car keys. This exchange went on for about a couple minutes while he periodically kept looking over his shoulder. I was silently panicking and trying to politely keep the situation from escalating by calmly and nonchalantly talking to him while also trying in vain to find my car keys to get us out of there. They were in there hiding good. I felt that at any moment he was going to pull a knife or gun or rob me, and my kids were right next to him, away from their mother on the other side of the car, and I couldn't find my car keys to get my kids into the safety of the car. He kept trying to engage them in conversation, and I could see that my oldest daughter was a little weirded out. She kept glancing at me to gauge my assessment and reaction to the situation. Being that he was only talking and acting friendly, and I was doing my best to stay calm, they were oblivious to the alarming situation we were all in, and being 9 months pregnant, and that I was no match for this full-grown man, especially if he was hiding a weapon on him. While still desperately digging for my keys, I tried to politely give him hints that the conversation was over by saying things like, "It was nice chatting with you, but I gotta get these kids to bed," and "It was nice meeting you," and telling my girls to say that it was nice meeting him too. My polite attempts to get this guy to leave wasn't working because he kept sidestepping my attempts and asking them what their favorite school subjects are and how nice young ladies they were, etc., while I was struggling with the shopping bags and digging in my giant cluttered purse for my car keys. My outgoing 7-year-old was completely oblivious to how not okay the situation was, because he was being friendly and because of the whole "I'm with mommy, so I'm safe" child mentality. So she started to talk about what she picked out for dad for Christmas, and started enthusiastically talking about kid stuff and asking him if he knew what Minecraft was, etc., and keeping this creep from leaving us alone by keeping him engaged in conversation. They didn't realize that I was becoming desperate to get them out of there. Then I suddenly felt this sinking feeling of dread when I realized that I may have lost my car keys in the mall, and that we were stuck outside with this strange man who kept looking over his shoulders and was showing no signs of walking away, and I was thinking that he was waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. All he had to do was grab one of my girls and threaten their life, knowing it would make me do whatever he wanted as long as he wouldn't hurt them. I started to feel my adrenaline start to spike, and my heart and stomach started doing flip-flops, and I felt like at any moment something was about to go down, as the gravity of realizing that there were no other people or witnesses around, and that they were totally alone with him at that moment, the odds were stacked against us and that he has his chance. He all of a sudden was all like, "Okay, it was nice talking to you, see you later," and walked off in the same direction as which he came. It wasn't until then I found my car keys and locked the car and told my kids to get in fast, and I got in too, and locked the doors and started the car and drove out of there. My 15-year-old lightheartedly and jokingly said, "Okay, that was weird," and laughed. I was overwhelmed with relief, and then I was confused over what just happened. I thought to myself, why the heck would a guy of seemingly sound mind think it was totally acceptable to go out of his way just to approach a woman and her kids in a deserted parking lot late at night just to chit-chat? But being that nothing bad happened, I brushed it off and joked about it too. When we got home, my husband greeted us and asked us how shopping went, and I said it went well, and my 15-year-old told him what happened in the parking lot and how weird it was and was kinda joking about it. I started joking too, saying how I was mentally having a panic attack while trying to look calm, and I started making fun of myself by telling my husband how I was attempting to inconspicuously rummage through my purse to find my car keys. My husband went completely white, and I acknowledged his horrified look of alarm, and I assured him that, albeit creepy, the guy was talking and eventually left on his own. Now, my father-in-law is a retired sheriff deputy, and my husband went through police academy training after graduating high school. He decided to go to business school instead of becoming a cop, and being that the knowledge he gained from that, plus growing up with a cop from my dad, I found out why my husband looked absolutely horrified when I told him about the details. What my husband told me completely rattled me to the bone. My husband told me that he was 100% sure the reason why that guy was hanging around us and chit-chatting was because he was waiting for me to unlock my car. And the reason why he was standing next to our kids was because once I unlocked the car and the kids started to get inside, he was most likely going to force himself into the car with the kids and hold a knife or gun to them to gain leverage on me to force me to cooperate, knowing that I wouldn't abandon my kids, which would force me to get into the car with them and then do whatever he wanted me to do, which most likely would be to drive to a remote location to do whatever knows what. And being that he wasn't wearing a mask, suggests that his intentions were to also leave no witnesses to identify him. I then remembered that he was positioned by the backseat passenger door where my 7-year-old was, standing by waiting to get in. My husband then told me that the most likely reason why the guy ended up leaving was because it took so long for me to find my keys, and the longer it took, the more anxious and spooked it made him. And that whole time, me trying to search for my car keys in my purse saved me from potentially being abducted. Alright everyone, that's it. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you did, consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. I have new memberships now enabled, which you can support me for $5 a month. The perks you get are priority reply to comments, members only chat rooms, and access to my Steam to be able to play PC games with me. So if you're interested in that, the support is much appreciated. I also live stream every now and then, so stay tuned for those. As always,
Have a nice day.